Question on this side.
Hi, Van Greenfield. Just following up a little bit on the question 2 minutes ago on what we could do. Philip, you had said in another article, my own instinct is that our ability to change reflectivity on the Earth's surface will in the end prove to have been far more important. In terms of the concept of reflectivity, could you expand on that and it's possible less expensive method for dealing with this?
Very briefly, please.
Very briefly, but it's a very important point. The point is very simple, that humans are not just doing CO2, we do many factors, and the way we have altered the albedo, as we call it, the surface reflectivity of the Earth, particularly, I may add, since the Neolithic Revolution in agriculture, has had probably quite a significant effect. However, we can't model it very well. And the problem is it's one of those big gaps, like many other things, in the models that we're talking, and that is a human factor. So in other words, I agree with that. Exactly how we cope with it, though, is another issue, because in fact we know so little about it. And can I remind everybody that IPCC, that we keep talking about, very honestly admits that we know very little about 80% of the factors behind climate change.
One more thing for the anti-side. Oh, you want to? Okay, go ahead and give a quick response to that. 20-second response. No?
What does 80% of the climate factors even mean? If you look at the radiative forcing from carbon dioxide, from methane, from nitrous oxides, from CFCs, from tropospheric ozone, from stratospheric ozone, from land use change, from aerosols, from black soot's impact on snow albedo, you know, all of those things, we know some of them very well, we know some of them less well. But to claim that we don't know anything about 80% of them it's a meaningless statistic.
Yeah, I'd like to, could I chime in there just for a moment?
Richard Sullivan, also 20 seconds.
Listen, it's fun to hear other people practicing meteorology without a license. So, you know, this field is like all fields of science. You know, medical science is incomplete and has uncertainties too, but it's good enough to be useful. You don't dismiss your doctor's advice because she hasn't solved all the diseases. And I think the same is true of climate science today. Don't dismiss it.
One retort.
Well, let's use an engineer. I don't think I'd want to cross Brooklyn Bridge if it had been built by an engineer who only understands 80% of the forces on that bridge.
There's one thing.
Actually, I think we might have a solution to the energy crisis. We just need to tap Philip Stott.
There's one thing that I think we need to get to before we wrap up. For the anti-side, they say the real crises today include poverty, dirty water, and a lack of modern energy supply to 4 billion poor people on Earth. So if this is a crisis, how do you prioritize it compared to those other things, and assuming that it takes tremendous amounts of resources to solve any of them?
You know, I cannot imagine why Philip Stott and Michael Crichton seem to think that doing something about these terrible crises is impossible if you do something about climate change, or even made more difficult. Climate change need not be in competition with or be an alternative to do something about the terrible toll that poverty and presentable disease take. We can do both of those and many other worthy things as well. In fact, it's exactly the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet who will suffer the most from the consequences of global warming, which goes on unabated.
Michael Crichton?
You know, I'm really fascinated at the number of newspaper headlines and articles that I see about global poverty and the difficulties of people in Africa as compared to the headlines about global warming. And it's, of course, Richard, it's very true that we can do two things at the same time. The reality is that we don't. And the reality is that we are failing and have continuously failed to address the issues of the third world, even though everyone knows that if you were to look at it for bangs for the buck, if you were to look at it from a humanitarian standpoint, if you were to look at it from the easiest way to do the most for environmental degradation that's occurring around the world, you would address global poverty. But we're not. We're talking as we're talking tonight. We're all getting very heated about something that may or may not happen 100 years from now. And while we're doing it, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 people are dead.
That concludes the discussion portion of our program.